We didn't look at this part, though.
No, the screencast cuts off at the last paragraph of the
Okay.
first page.
So, what you'll see over and over again in this text is this constant iteration of the dynamic between external stimulus and then what we would call sort of philosophical speculation. And if you think about the story itself, it constantly follows this pattern of moving in this way from an external stimulus that is perceived by the senses. It's about sensory perception, first of all. And this is almost on a paragraph level. This almost sort of functions as like an outline of all the paragraphs in this story. It triggers a stream of consciousness. And then ends with sort of abstract speculation. And so the story itself has this, what we call a phenomenological dynamic. And the phenomenology, I told you this last time, I think, is the interrogation into the nature of perception. Interrogation into the nature of perception and human interaction in the environment. And the story itself, I think, is you could describe it as a phenomenological one. It is interrogating and representing the way that process occurs where, and for example in this opening paragraph here, the tree outside the window taps very gently on the pane. What we see, though, in a lot of this story is an actual effort to turn away from this world, this sort of external world, because it's masculine. The internal life of the narrator and speculation of philosophy and literature are, in her mind, I think, feminine. And there is a deep, deep suspicion in this story of the external world of objective reality as an entirely masculine domain, that is governed by patriarchal values of Edwardian Britain, and that itself is a sort of extension of Victorian values that have led civilization to war, to militarization. You know, you think of, those of you West Civ bods, you know about the arms race in the lead up to the First World War, and the utterly inept destruction that war represented was the major contextual issue of this period of time. A sense of unfathomable stupidity that created this absolutely enormous sort of apocalyptic catastrophe that destroyed a generation, absolutely destroyed a generation of Western civilization and other parts of the world too. That world is what I think this narrator associates with the external world. That is the world of external circumstance. That's where it's led us. That is why she wants to move inwards. That is the whole impetus for this internal, introspective narrative style in this story. This is the only refuge, is the mind and then the abstract speculation that can be gleaned from the movements of the mind. The abstract speculation that you can take from the product of your own thoughts. And so take a look at that dynamic in this paragraph. We start with this tree outside the window tapping very gently on the pane, which is, again, a very gentle reminder of this external circumstance. She then says, I want to think quietly, calmly, spaciously, never to be interrupted, never to have to rise from my chair, to slip easily from one thing to another without any sense of hostility or obstacle. And there's a complete sense of preference for that individual world over the external one in the story itself. She's explicitly articulating that preference at that point in time. But then, she moves on here and says, I want to sink deeper and deeper away from the surface with its hard, separate facts. That is this process explicitly articulated. I don't want the world that has brought me World War I and empire and racism, colonialism, patriarchy. Those are not things that seem to make sense to me. The hard separate facts, I think, are really important, have a really important signification in this story, is that objective reality is turned away from. But I also think here this functions as an explicit explanation of the narrative style. This is what is going to be narrated. This process here, the tapping on the window, it's going to probe something that I'm going to try and actively ignore. And then by doing that, it's going to provoke my thoughts. So it's not actually an active engagement with the sensory stimulation of the external environment. It's an effort to ignore it or keep it uncertain. And that's why the story is called what it is called, the mark on the wall. It isn't called snail, because that is what the mark on the wall is in the end. It is the snail. And so that sense of uncertainty that she has about what she's looking at is deliberately cultivated to provide the impetus for introspection and for the internal life that is the thing that is the only thing that's trustworthy in the story. She then says, to steady myself, let me catch hold of the first idea that passes. Shakespeare. Well, he will do as well as any other, a man who sat himself solidly in an armchair and looked into the fire. So her active effort to evade external circumstance is with her own thoughts. What's the first thought? Shakespeare. I think what this is telling us is that she is self-identifying as a writer. I think this is heavily autobiographical, this story, and that this is what she thinks in her mind. But there's an enormous amount of anxiety that surrounds this figure. You know, if you think about any of you that have any interest in writing or any other kind of endeavour, the least helpful thing to keep in your mind is the single greatest one in the language that you choose to write in. And so I think there's an enormous amount of anxiety, and what it's saying to us then is, even my own thoughts are infected by a patriarchy, masculine-dominated environment. Literary tradition is saturated with male power also.
When she says and looked into the fire, does she refer to the Plato's?
Absolutely. Anytime you hear that act of perception at something being invoked, there's Shakespeare, the ideal form of the writer. There he is in his Platonic abstraction almost. You know, he, in this writer's mind, is the archetype that all the rest of us are mere forms. You know, we are mere physical embodiments of this idealized archetype. And this is not a productive train of thought for her. And she looks into the fire as a result. A shower of ideas fell perpetually from some very high heaven down through his mind. And so she speculates on him doing exactly the same thing that she's doing. She's imagining Shakespeare doing exactly what she's doing at this moment in time. He leant his forehead on his hand and people looking in through the open door. But then stops. She stops this speculation. For this scene is supposed to take place on a summer's evening. But how dull this historical fiction. So we've got her in the act of writing almost here. We've got her in the imaginative act of conjuring Shakespeare in the same scenario that she finds herself in. But the important thing here is the fact that she interrupts this and then says, it doesn't interest me at all. This is no use to me. Because this internal speculation is being infected by all of the things that I'm trying to evade. All of the world that I'm trying to provide an alternative to is still here in my mind because of the way I'm thinking about my own identity as a writer and the literary tradition that she sees herself as engaging with. And we get that sense, I think, of this being unproductive in the next sentence where she says, I wish I could hit upon a pleasant track of thought, a track indirectly reflecting credit upon myself. For those are the pleasantest thoughts. She wants to try and shape the passage of her thoughts. She wants to try and direct them towards something that's going to make her feel good, not a comparison to someone significantly more talented than her in her own mind. It's nice to know that even some of the greatest writers have this very human anxiety about their own inadequacies. It makes you feel a lot better about yourself. And she here, I want something different. I want to think about something different, because let's not kid ourselves. It's always nice to have our ego flattered, is what she appears to be saying. And very frequent in the minds of modest, mouse-coloured people who believe genuinely that they dislike to hear their own praises. And I think the alliteration she uses in that sentence, the minds of modest, mouse-coloured people who think that they don't like to hear themselves praised, I think she's including herself in this. You know, there's an element of self-loathing there, but that alliteration, I think, almost suggests, I think, the sort of stupidity of the self-delusion that psychological act is supposed to show. That we're good at kidding ourselves that we don't like to hear our own praises sung, but really we all do. And this is what she's saying. And then the thing that follows next is an example from her own life, I think, an anecdote that illuminates this concept. They are not thoughts directly praising oneself. That is the beauty of them. They are thoughts like this. And then I came into the room. They were discussing botany. I said how I'd seen a flower growing on a dust heap on the site of an old house in Kingsway. The seed, I said, must have been sown in the reign of Charles I. What flowers grew in the reign of Charles I, I asked. What do you think? What do you make of this anecdote? Why do you think she chooses this as an anecdote to illuminate this concept of thoughts that make you feel good about yourself? Because we assume, I think, that this comes from her own life. What satisfaction is she getting out of retelling that anecdote, do you think?
She shows her intelligence that she showed upon instinct.
Absolutely.
Something that happened quickly and she thought of it quickly.
Yeah, instinctive and rapid. What else would you say, Juicy?
That maybe it's, I don't know, related to Kew Gardens.
In what way? Tell me.
Because they're discussing about botany, and I don't know, but maybe she wants to talk about the garden in a more profound level.
Yeah, you can see, well, one thing that you can definitely see is, well, here's the interest for all of those flowers in that other story. If she knows what flowers were grown in the reign of Charles I, there's a particularly odd combination of domain expertises, I think, in this anecdote. If you look at what you'd have to know to be able to come up with this, you'd have to be a sort of specialist in some quite odd topic areas. I came into the room, they were discussing botany, that's one of them, the growth of plant and plant life. How I'd seen a flower growing on a dust heap on the site of an old house in Kingsway. The seed, I said, must have been sown in the reign of Charles I, and what flowers grew in the reign of Charles I? What is she sort of indirectly showing that she understands there, as well as flowers? Charles I, what subject? Yeah, and that's the thing. Not only those two separate subject domains, but the connection between the two of them. So there's a real, in this story, there is an indirect exposure of her own learning and her own sort of intellectual prowess. But she knows that, and that's why she's telling us it. This is what I want to think about. This is what makes me feel good.
And then she says she doesn't remember the answer because she wasn't paying attention after, because she was so happy about herself that she got to show this.
Absolutely. And this is where there's this huge element, I think, of self-criticism in this anecdote. The story itself is an anecdote from her own life that is about how good she feels about herself rather than what she ends up talking about. And so the irony at the end, but I don't remember the answer, is a rhetorical trope, I think, called aporia. Aporia is where you have an unresolvable tension. An unresolvable tension on the level of language. Having this satisfaction about the topic area and then not knowing the answer to the question is a fairly unresolvable tension, I think, because it's presenting her both as learned and lacking in understanding. But at that particular time, I think there's a doubt about the actual concrete past, and then also what it indirectly shows us is that she wasn't really thinking about the content. She was distracted by her own self-satisfaction. That story is great because it reminds me of feeling good, but ironically, I didn't know the answer to my own question. So it's a product of her own loss of focus on the content. It becomes more about how it made her feel. And then she guesses. Tall flowers with purple tassels to them, perhaps, and so it goes on. All the time, I'm dressing up the figure of myself in my own mind, lovingly, stealthily, not openly adoring it, for if I did that, I should catch myself out and stretch my hand at once for a book in self-protection. What's going on here, do you think? This is where it gets a lot more complicated, this little section.
So wait, the answer is tall flowers. She's guessing.
She just guesses. She just guesses. She just guesses, and it's not really the point. Mm-hmm. The story itself is not about...
Show her herself.
Absolutely. Dressing herself up. She is constructing herself like a writer would construct a character here. There is an element of self-construction in this particular narrative. Dressing my own mind lovingly and stealthily, but not openly adoring it because it's too vain, it's too egotistical.
She wants to be humble.
Yeah, and so she looks for a book in self-protection if she feels like she's getting to the point.
From her,
yeah, exactly that. But the whole point of this is that she has fully conscious awareness of all of this self-deceptive trickery that our minds play on us. And that's what's being represented, really. How easy we delude ourselves. How wonderful we are at tricking ourselves into what we believe, what we want to believe. And that's what she goes on to reflect in the next sentence. It's curious how instinctively one protects the image of oneself from idolatry or any other handling that could make it ridiculous or too unlike the original to be believed in any longer. And so she's protecting herself from idolatry. She's trying here to say we try not to worship ourselves too much because those stories end up becoming so unlike our real selves that they lose credibility. So what she's trying to capture, I think, in between that all, is the deceptive sort of middle ground that lots of our thoughts hover in to keep us going. We have to do this, otherwise we go mad. And there's a reason she had clinical depression. It's because she's paying very close attention to the self-delusions that we tell ourselves that are necessary to just get us through the day. And I can tell you that as a teacher, they're even more important. You know, you come out of a class and you watch a teacher and they're like, I really enjoyed that. And your class of kids come out and they're like, oh, my eyes are bleeding. That was the most boring thing ever. But we have to tell ourselves to a certain extent that we're not totally awful. Otherwise, we'd never do what we do. You know, you have to have an element of actually deliberately cultivated sort of egotism to survive a job like teaching, to survive a job where you are constantly at the mercy of other people's perception of you. And we are particularly good at coming up with a nice middle ground because it seems sort of unnoticeable, you know. One of the things that human beings are particularly powerful at is what's called post hoc reasoning. You know, it is the thing that usually creates us to misattribute what's called causality. This thing happened, then so did this, that must have caused the second thing. We are particularly good at, for example, you know, if you were wandering through a bar or something like that, or a public cafe, and someone that you thought was attractive looked at you and sort of looked pleased, the story that you would tell yourself is, oh, I must have really done something good today, my hair must look good. But there could be absolutely no correlation between someone smiling at you and what you've just done. But post hoc reasoning is the story that you tell yourself afterwards to provide a rational explanation for what's happened. This is what we do to ourselves. We always are undergoing post hoc reasoning. Oh, we did that, and that must be because I did all these things. You know, I do it all the time teaching. You know, oh, these essays were terrible. It's my fault. I must have not taught these things properly. Or these were great. Aren't I fantastic? But sometimes there's no correlation. You know, there's a famous sort of slogan that says correlation doesn't imply causality. Just because two things seem to connect doesn't mean that one causes the other. Here, she is, I think, attacking that habit of post hoc reasoning. She's poking at it and saying, we're so good at deluding ourselves at the reasoning for things happening. We're so good at telling ourselves stories about ourselves that make ourselves feel comforted and better. And there's a reason why this produces quite poor mental health. It's because we start to realise, I think, that the extent to which we rely on illusions for our own mental health, and that she's trying to unravel them, I think, in this story. And then she says, or is it not so very curious after all? It is a great matter of importance. So there's, on one hand, an attempt to diminish the significance of what she's just been talking about, and then on another, a way of saying, well, actually, it's a kind of life or death matter, and it really is for her. She ends up killing herself because she suffered from really morbid clinical depression. And you can see how a mind that produces that mental outcome works. This is what we're getting in this story, is the habits of mind that produce really disastrous mental health outcomes. We need an element of self-deception to be healthy, I think.
What does it say under juxtaposing?
Hesitancy with magnitude. So she's got a sense of hesitancy and uncertainty here, but then also in the next sentence, a statement of its importance. Isn't this so very vital? Isn't this so crucial? Well, yeah. And she says it's, suppose the looking glass smashes, the image disappears, and the romantic figure with the green of forest depths all about it is there no longer, but only that shell of a person which is seen by other people. What an airless, shallow, bald, prominent world it becomes. This is what happens if you smash all your self-illusions and self-deceptions, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are. This is always one of the most depressing moments in life, is when the story you tell yourself about who you are jars very heavily with the way other people perceive you. It's extremely depressing. This is what she's focusing on. A world not to be lived in. As we face each other in omnibuses and underground railways, we are looking into the mirror that accounts for the vagueness, the gleam of glassiness in our eyes. We have this, first of all, that habitual tension between physical closeness and psychological distance. People in this scene are right up next to each other on the underground, but miles away from each other psychologically. We can be in physical proximity, but psychologically alienated from one another.
Like you guys.
Absolutely. But we're looking into the mirror that accounts for the vagueness, the gleam of glassiness in our eyes. This is an extremely powerful metaphor, I think, for describing what we were just talking about. That when we're looking at other people, we're really producing their image of themselves, and that they're producing their image of themselves in the knowledge that you're looking at them. So when you guys all look at me when I'm explaining something to you, I'm producing an image of myself, the image of a teacher. And I have to tell myself that I'm a good one, otherwise why the hell would I get out of bed? But there's times when I'm not. And you have to be quite robust emotionally and psychologically to take that moment and be honest about it with yourself. And that's what she's saying, is that's the gleam of glassiness in our eyes, our willful self-deception. And the novelists in future will realise more and more the importance of these reflections. For of course there is not one reflection, but an almost infinite number. The way that other people perceive you, and that you are not objectively an essence. You are not something that exists objectively in and of itself without being affected by the way other people perceive you. Other people's perceptions are infinite in number and largely what constructs who you are. This is, if you want a visual analogy for this sensation, think of a Picasso portrait. Someone's face, there's a bit over here, there's a bit up there, there's a bit round there, there's a bit from the behind, there's a bit from the side. That cubist aesthetic which you see in Picasso paintings is the attempt to visually process that idea that a portrait of someone's face in realist terms is what one person thinks it looks like. Picasso's artwork is all about showing us multiple perceptions simultaneously. This is what this person looks like from the side, from above, from below, from 10 years in the future, from 13 years in the past. You know, all of those acts of perception brought to bear on that moment of artistic representation. She's saying that here, that novelists will realise the importance of these reflections, i.e. me. I will realise the importance of our subjective impressions of each other and the power that they have over our identities and our lives. That in the act of subjective, relative perception, you are partly constructing someone else. You are determining who they are. And there is an element of truth in this. It's not, if we're looking at this from the perspective of science, it's not exactly true. But there is an element of artistic truth in this. And when you think about the way you perceive someone else can have a controlling influence over who they are, it makes us very wary of even the fact that our own thoughts have a sort of determining power over the identities of other people. If you perceive, and I can give you another teacher example. There's a very clear body of evidence that if you are told that a kid sucks, the kid will suck. And it is proven by numerous studies that if you, for example, take a couple of students and one of them is underachieving massively and tell the teacher that they're underachieving, the kid stays underachieving. If you don't tell the teacher and tell them, actually, this kid is really bright but just struggles a little bit with da-da-da-da-da, they outperform the others. And so the act of the teacher's perception is determining the way that the student's life operates. So if you know that you are being perceived as limited, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so what this gives us in this story is quite a shocking revelation about the power of relativistic, subjective perception to actually determine the nature of someone's identity. And that's what she's saying. Novelists of the future will realise this more and more. The power of these reflections, the things that are constructed in the act of individual perception of other people. And that's what's phenomenological. The act of identity is constituted through what we call a phenomenological process, the act of perceiving. For of course there is not one reflection but an infinite number. Those are the depths they will explore, those the phantoms they will pursue, leaving the description of reality more and more out of their stories, taking a knowledge of it for granted. I don't need to tell you what a fruit bowl looks like, because you know what a fruit bowl looks like. Let me tell you how the way that you're perceiving each other is determining the nature of your existence. There's modernism in a nutshell. This story has an explicit articulation of some of what we call the aesthetic imperatives of modernism, the things that this text at this time are attempting to do, to say, screw this, I don't want to talk about, XYZ jolly man once upon a time who came here through the fields and da-da-da-da-da-da, giving us a nice illusion of chronological order and familiarity and accurate representations of the surroundings. I want to get into the nature of phenomenology and the way that perception works and the way that all of these psychological mechanisms operate in the construction of our identity and the determination of our existence. That's the purpose of literary modernism. And she is one of its sort of representative exponents from Virginia Woolf. However, it's something that the Greeks did, and Shakespeare perhaps. But then we get to the end of all of that, the thing that we've spent half an hour explaining, and she says, but these generalizations are very worthless. So congratulations, guys, you spent 30 minutes analysing half a paragraph of a story, and it was a complete waste of time, according to Virginia Woolf. The military sound of the word is enough. It recalls leading articles, cabinet ministers, a whole class of things indeed, which as a child one thought the thing itself, the standard thing, the real thing, from which one could not depart, save at the risk of nameless damnations. Here's this world again. The external world of masculine circumstance, militaristic conflict, economic greed, political calamity, comes from her mention of the word generalization, because it contains within it the word general. And it's a military role. And that's what she said, the military sound of the word is enough. And so all of that endeavour to probe the internal life of the mind, unravelled at a trick because of one word and its etymology, is the word history. It's got the word general inside it. Bang! All of this comes back again. The word recalls leading articles in newspapers, cabinet ministers, a whole class of things which as a child one thought the thing itself. All of the things that you are taught as a kid to believe are reality itself and the thing that's determining your identity. Politicians, power, economic class, the government, society, war, conflict, all of the elements of life that constitute our identity if we choose to see ourselves according to those different facets of existence. Your race, your age, your gender, your body weight, your skin colour, your job, all of those things are the external world of patriarchy. Generalizations bring back somehow Sunday in London, Sunday afternoon walks, Sunday luncheons, and also ways of speaking of the dead, clothes and habits like the habit of sitting all together in one room until a certain hour, although nobody liked it. There was a rule for everything. Doing what you're told because it's what everyone thinks you should do. So this is where all of those social norms and social orthodoxy is embodied in actions that she describes here.
So what does she mean by nameless damnation?
Which one could not depart save at the risk of nameless damnation. If you choose not to engage in that world of external circumstance, of getting a job, of doing the right thing, of believing in the Queen, of fighting for your country, of being patriotic, of believing in money, all of those values that are social orthodoxy, you are subject to nameless damnation. You are not part of society, but no one's ever going to call it anything. You are occluded from participating in society without really anyone even having to do anything. You're just not included and you are damned by that segregation. And then these, this really speaks to me, this particular line. I love this line. I hate this kind of thing. Everyone doing everything because everyone else does it and they all think that they should and it's normal, even though everyone dislikes it. I think Christmas is kind of like this. Sorry to ruin everyone's day. My own family are very, very, not religious in the slightest, actually. And I'm always like, why do we even bother with this? What's the point of this? Like, what? Well, everyone does it, so we have to. Like, what a waste of time. And it's acts like this, acts of social orthodoxy that people just internalize, perform, without really any authentic connection to what they represent and what they mean, that represent this world of external circumstance that has the ability to dictate who you are. You might get a job that you don't really like or care about, and that dictates who you are partly. That whole process of being dictated by circumstances of your life that are themselves driven by social norms that you've had no control of, as a way of defining who you are, is not acceptable in the mind of this writer. That is not what I want for myself. I cannot trust this external world because anytime I engage with it, it tries to do this to me. It tries to get at me and lead me to being a fake version of myself. And there's a rule for everything. The rule for tablecloths at that particular period was that they should be made of tapestry with little yellow compartments marked upon them, such as you may see in photographs of the carpets in the corridors of the royal palaces. Tablecloths of a different kind were not real tablecloths. How shocking and yet how wonderful it was to discover that these real things, Sunday luncheons, Sunday walks, country houses, tablecloths, were not entirely real, were indeed half phantoms. And the damnation which visited the disbeliever in them was only a sense of illegitimate freedom. Remember, she is from an extremely posh, upper-class background, Virginia Woolf, so that sense of social orthodoxy and tradition is extremely rigid in Edwardian Britain. Britain of the early 1900s, in the upper echelons of society, is a world where you do as you are told and you do what is the norm. This is exactly how you are supposed to behave. It's a very rigid, Victorian and Edwardian set of social norms and moralities. And that eventually she finds that these things are only half phantoms. They're only half real. They're only real because everyone chooses to believe in them. and that the damnation which you experience if you choose not to is actually just a sense of illegitimate freedom. Freedom from them that is illegitimate in the eyes of society. But then, what takes the place of these things? What now takes the place of these things, I wonder, those real standard things? Men, perhaps should you be a woman? The masculine point of view which governs our lives, which sets the standard, which establishes Whitaker's table of precedency, which has become, I suppose, since the war, half a phantom to many men and women, which soon, one may hope, will be laughed into the dustbin where the phantoms go, the mahogany sideboards and the Landseer prints, gods and devils, hell and so forth, leaving us all with an intoxicating sense of illegitimate freedom, if freedom exists. Now, there's a number of allusions in this particular passage of the text which are contextual. Whitaker's table of precedency is a sort of encyclopedic categorization of information that is basically the codification of reality in a book. Reality as coded, but in the act of coding it, it is decided what is valuable and what is important. And it contains, information about currencies and contemporary affairs. It's a sort of source book of contemporary trivia and encyclopedic information. But that book functions as a symbol of patriarchy in this text. This is a symbol of the external reality that governs everyone's lives, that is dictated by social norms and is at odds with this character's internal being. I do not relate to this world, and I cannot connect to it. And these are all what we would call metonyms. You ever heard of this term before? A metonym? A metonym, a synecdoche, are very similar to metaphors, but they're slightly different. And I'll show you the difference. A metonym is something that is that stands for an abstract concept, so it functions like a metaphor, but it has a logical, real connection with it. So when you think of a metonym, you think of the White House. The White House itself stands for the presidency. So when someone says the presidency, the White House, is the metonymic representation of this. Synecdoche is a very similar device, but when this is part of the whole. So if someone says, hey, that's a neat set of wheels, man, they're talking about a car, they're using this rhetorical trope, synecdoche. These two are really worth learning because they're very often mistakenly called metaphors, and they're not.
Can you repeat the difference?
So, a metonym is often, the easiest way to make sense of a metonym is a more literalized symbol. It's like a symbol, but the connection between the two things is logical. So there's a logical connection between the building, the White House, and the abstract concept of the presidency. It's not a symbol of the presidency, but it's a metonymic representation of it. It's something that is connected to it literally, but stands as a sort of quasi-symbolic representation of it. If you said things like, for the flag stands for the concept of nationhood. A synecdoche is when that thing is actually a physical part of what it represents. So if you said like wheels on a car, the wheels are actually part of the car, physically. If you called your clothes your threads, that would be synecdoche as well, because it's a part of the actual thing that it represents. That's the only difference. Synecdoche is a part of the thing that it represents. All of these things in the bottom of this paragraph, I think, are metonyms for Victorian morality and patriarchy. Whitaker's table of precedency, mahogany sideboards, Landseer prints. Edward Landseer is a sort of extremely socially orthodox painter. Gods and devils, hell and so forth. Religion altogether. Leaving us all with an intoxicating sense of illegitimate freedom. Those are all, I think, metonymical representations of Victorian patriarchy.
But isn't it also connected because they are within the time?
The confusion here is if this is literally part of the thing that it represents. If something is literally a part of the thing that it represents, then it's a synecdoche. If it's not literally, physically a part of the thing that it represents, then it's a metonymy. So here, Whitaker's table of precedency isn't a physical component of patriarchy. It can't be, because patriarchy is an abstract concept. So Whitaker's table of precedency has a symbolic property, but I think it functions metonymically in many ways, and so do the Landseer prints, and so do the gods and devils.
So, like, if someone's talking about Christianity and they say Jesus, is that a metonym?
At that particular point, if you say, when we say things like the Lord, that at that point, if you're using that to conjure up the notion of the entire religion, that is metonymic. So if you're using it to invoke the concept of Christianity, then it's metonymic. To be honest, if you were to call them symbols, no one would ever criticize you. If you were to call that a symbol, no one would ever say Whitaker's table of precedency is a symbol. It is, but in real nitty-gritty technical terms, it's metonymic. Those are just two techniques that are worth bearing in mind, because a lot of the time, you'll call them metaphors or symbols. That's what you've been trained to call them, but there's something slightly more precise version of those things. They're types of metaphoric signification.
So these are metaphors, or
they have metaphorical signification, but they're not metaphors. Metaphors are when the two things that are being compared are completely unrelated and unlike each other. But an element of comparison is the basis for the figurative language. The figurative means comparing one thing to another, really. That's what we mean when we say figurative. Like a figure is a non-literal comparison. And so, you know, if you call the sun an egg yolk, there's nothing to do with the sun. You know, the sun isn't an egg yolk. There's no logical connection between the two things, but you might be trying to draw out some signification about the sun by calling it one. You're trying to draw out something surprising, usually, by calling it a metaphor. This is a bamboozling little concept, this metonym and synecdoche. It's particularly important when we get to poetry, because it crops up a lot more in poetry than I think students are trained to pick out. They go back to the mark on the wall. In certain lights, that mark on the wall seems actually to project from the wall. And so there's, again, in this story, an insistence on what we would call the relative nature of perception. What you see is not absolute objective concrete reality. It is something relative to your phenomenological experience, such as time. And we'll stop there. But think about, you know, Einstein's discovery of